The chalice was cool in her hands, its silver surface beaded with condensation from the spiced wine within. It was a small ritual, one of her own making. Every night Adrian worked late in his study, buried under the weight of a kingdom that never slept. She would bring him this, a small, warm anchor to the mortal world, to her. The scent of cinnamon and cloves was a familiar comfort as she walked the silent, echoing corridors of the castle. Here, after midnight, the ancient stones seemed to exhale the cold of centuries, but the thought of Adrian's smile, the way his impossibly dark eyes would soften when he saw her, was a hearth fire in her heart. For 2 years this castle had been her home, a human queen in a court of immortal predators. It should have been terrifying, a fairy tale spun in reverse, but Adrian had made it a sanctuary. With him, she was not a fragile curiosity or a political pawn. She was simply Rose, his Rose. And the sharp-boned, elegant vampires of his court had, in time, followed their king's lead. Their deference was flawless, their respect a polished, impenetrable veneer. She had allowed herself to believe it was real. The doors to his study were massive, carved from the heart of a petrified forest, and stood slightly ajar. A sliver of golden candlelight spilled onto the flagstones, a welcoming path. She heard voices from within, low and resonant. She slowed her steps, not wanting to intrude on matters of state. It was a habit born of her new station, to know when to be a queen and when to be a shadow. She was about to turn away, to wait on the stone bench in the alcove, when a voice, sharp and cold as splintered ice, cut through the low murmur. "It has been 2 years, sire." She froze, her hand hovering near the cold iron of the door handle. The voice belonged to Elder Valerius, his words as precise and merciless as the man himself. 2 years, and the human remains human. A charming novelty, perhaps, but a novelty that has worn thin. Your reign requires stability. It requires a future. A human queen is a liability. Her only redemption is a dampier heir. Rose's breath caught in her throat. The silver chalice suddenly felt impossibly heavy, its weight pulling her down toward the cold, unforgiving floor. She could not move, could not breathe. She was rooted to the spot, a prisoner of the terrible words that continued to slice through the heavy silence of the corridor. "The bloodline must be secured," another voice added, deeper, rougher. "Cassian. A half-blood child would bind the mortal and immortal realms, solidify your power in a way no treaty ever could. She was brought here for a purpose. If she cannot fulfill it, if she is barren, then she has no purpose." Barren. The word was an obscenity, a brand. It landed in the quiet of her mind with the force of a physical blow. She pressed her fingers into the cool silver of the cup, the intricate scrollwork biting into her skin. She must be discarded. Valerius's conclusion was delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. Not a suggestion, a pronouncement. The silence that followed was the most brutal sound she had ever heard. It stretched, thin and taut, a wire drawn around her chest. This was the moment. The moment Adrian would rise in a fury of righteous rage, his voice the thunder that would shake the very foundations of the castle. The moment he would tell them that she was his wife, his queen, not a vessel to be filled and then cast aside. She waited for the explosion, for his defense. She braced for it, prayed for it. But it did not come. Instead, after a silence that lasted an eternity, 1 second, 2, 3, a lifetime, Adrian's voice finally came, and it was not thunder. It was quiet. It was measured. It was the calm, controlled voice of a king weighing a political calculus. "I hear your concerns," he said. Just that, 4 words. Not a denial, not a furious rebuttal, an acknowledgement. He heard them. He was considering it. The floor fell away from beneath her feet. The warmth of the spiced wine in the chalice seemed to leach into the air, leaving only a profound, hollowing cold. He was their king before he was her husband, and his kingdom needed an heir. His silence was not silence at all. It was agreement. It was the sound of her own worth being weighed and found wanting. The chalice trembled violently in her grip. Wine, dark as blood, sloshed over the rim, tracing a searingly cold path down her wrist. She didn't feel it. She felt nothing but the vast, empty chasm that had opened inside her. She had to get away. Moving with a slowness that felt dreamlike, she took a single, silent step back. Then another. Her body moved with an animal instinct for self-preservation, retreating from the source of the pain. She reached a carved console table by the wall, its surface dusty in the dim light. With painstaking care, as if the chalice were made of spun glass, she set it down. Her hand left a damp, dark red print on the polished wood. A stain. She turned and fled, her soft slippers making no sound on the stone. She was a ghost already, haunting the life she had mistakenly believed was her own. The shattering wasn't in the corridor, not a sound anyone could hear. It happened deep inside, a quiet, catastrophic implosion of hope, leaving behind nothing but the fine, sharp dust of what used to be her heart. She reached their chambers and bolted the door, the heavy thud of the iron bar echoing the frantic hammering in her chest. The rooms, their sanctuary, felt alien now. The vast canopied bed, draped in silks the color of a twilight sky, was not a place of intimacy, but a monument to her failure. The air, usually scented with the dried lavender and rose petals she kept in porcelain bowls, smelled of nothing. Her senses had shut down, a fortress pulling up its drawbridge against a world that had suddenly become hostile territory. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold wood of the door, and wrapped her arms around herself. She did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears, a wound cauterized by the cold fire of the trail. She replayed the scene in her mind, a torturous loop. Valerius's cruel clinical words, Cassian's blunt assessment, and Adrian, his calm, reasonable voice. "I hear your concerns." He had not defended her. He had not defended their love. He had listened to their terms for her disposal. A human liability. Her only redemption, an heir. If barren, discarded. The words were stones, building a wall around her, brick by painful brick. She had always known she was different, a single fragile heartbeat in a world of silent, eternal ones. A flicker of warmth in an eternity of cool marble. She had thought that was her strength, the thing he loved in her. Now she saw it for what it was, a flaw, a fatal deficiency. When Adrian finally came to the door hours later, his soft knock was a shock against the wood she leaned on. "Rose, are you in there?" She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her lips together to stifle the sound that wanted to escape her. "My love, the guard said you returned hours ago. Are you unwell?" His voice was laced with a concern that now sounded like a lie. Was he assessing her already? Checking on his failing investment? She couldn't answer. She could not conjure a single word. After a moment, he stopped knocking. She heard the faint click of a key in a different lock, a private entrance that connected his adjoining dressing room. Her breath hitched. He was coming in. She scrambled to her feet, moving to the far side of the room, near the cold hearth, wanting to put as much space between them as possible. He entered, and the sight of him was a fresh agony. He was as beautiful as a fallen angel, his dark hair unbound and falling over the shoulders of his black silk shirt. His face, usually a mask of regal composure, was etched with worry. "Rose," he breathed, his eyes finding her in the shadows. "What is it? You're pale as moonlight." He moved toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He reached for her, his hand outstretched. She flinched. It was an involuntary, violent jerk away from his touch. His hand stopped in midair. A flicker of hurt, of deep confusion crossed his features. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and wounded. The lie came easily, a bitter, protective shell. "A headache," she whispered, her voice rough. "It came on suddenly. I just needed to be alone." "You should have sent for me." He didn't try to touch her again, but he stood so close she could feel the faint, unnatural coolness of his skin. He was studying her, his gaze intense, searching. It felt like an interrogation. "You're trembling." "I'm cold," she lied again, wrapping her arms more tightly around herself. He looked toward the hearth. "I'll have a fire lit." "No," she said, too quickly, too sharply. "No, please. I just want to sleep." She needed him to leave. Every second in his presence was a torment. His gentle concern a cruel mockery of the truth she now carried. He hesitated, his dark eyes filled with 1,000 questions she could not answer. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "As you wish," he said softly. "Sleep well, my love." He retreated from the room, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. She stood there for a long time, a statue of a queen in a palace that was no longer her own, listening to the sound of her own fragile, human heart breaking. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, a study in gray. Rose drifted through the castle like a wraith, a pale imitation of the woman she had been. Color seemed to have bled from the world, leaving only muted, sorrowful shades. The vibrant tapestries depicting ancient hunts looked like scenes of carnage. The light filtering through the stained glass windows cast bruises of color on the stone floors. The castle itself, once a place of wonder, now felt like a gilded cage, its every arch and parapet a reminder of her precarious position. She ate little, the finest foods turning to ash in her mouth. She slept less, haunted by whispers and silences. Every interaction was a trial. The courtiers' bows seemed deeper, their smiles tighter, tinged with a pity that felt like contempt. She saw them in clusters in the hallways, their low conversations stopping the moment she approached. Were they talking about her? About the barren human queen? The whispers followed her, real or imagined, a constant, corrosive hiss. Adrian was a constant, gentle pressure against the wall of her misery. He did not understand, and his attempts to breach her solitude only deepened her despair. He would appear at her side in the library, a rare, leather-bound volume of poetry in his hand, and offer to read to her. The intimacy of the gesture, once a source of profound joy, now felt like a performance. She would listen to the beautiful, empty words, her mind 1,000 miles away, counting the syllables of his betrayal. "I hear your concerns." "You're still unwell," he would say, his brow furrowed with a genuine, painful concern she could no longer trust. "You are thinner, there are shadows under your eyes." He would reach to cup her cheek, and she would turn her head at the last second, pretending to look at a tapestry, causing his fingers to brush against her hair instead. Every avoided touch was a small, sharp victory and a devastating loss. "I'm just tired," she would reply, the same lie wearing thin between them. The changing of the seasons. He didn't believe her, she knew. He was a being who had lived for 1,000 years. He could read the subtle shifts in a person's heart like a scholar reads ancient text. But he did not push. He simply watched her, his gaze a heavy cloak of sorrow and confusion. His patience was its own form of torture. It would be easier if he were cruel, if he grew angry at her withdrawal. It would give her something to fight against, but his tenderness left her with no defense, forcing her to retreat further into the frozen landscape of her own heart. One afternoon he found her in the glass gardens, a vast conservatory where impossible bioluminescent flowers bloomed year-round. She was staring at a moon-petal orchid, its petals so pale they were nearly translucent. I remember when we found this specimen in the southern jungles, he said, his voice soft beside her. You said it was too fragile to survive the journey, but it did. It's stronger than it looks. The metaphor was so transparent it was painful. She felt a surge of bitter anger. Did he think her a wilting flower that needed a bit of sun? She turned to him, her eyes cold. Some things are not meant to survive in a foreign climate, she said, her voice flat. They wither and die and are replaced. The hurt that flashed in his eyes was immediate and deep. He took a step back as if she had struck him. Rose, he whispered, his voice hoarse. What has happened? What have I done? She wanted to scream it at him. You did nothing. You sat there in your study and did nothing while they sentenced me. But the words were trapped behind a wall of fear. If she said it, he would have to answer. He would have to confirm it. He would use his careful, diplomatic words to explain the needs of the kingdom, the logic of the bloodline, and he would gently, regretfully, agree that her time here was over. The uncertainty was agony, but the confirmation would be annihilation. So she said nothing. She simply turned back to the translucent flower and willed him to go away. After a long, heavy silence, he did. The silence he left behind was worse than his presence. It was in that hollow, aching quiet that the idea took root. It was a terrible, desperate seed of a thought, but it was also the only path she could see forward. She could not live like this, waiting for the axe to fall. She could not wait for Adrian to finally have the courage to discard her. She had to know, for certain. The royal physicians were all vampires, loyal to the elders and the crown. She could not go to them. Her secret would be a matter of public record before the sun set. She needed someone outside the castle walls, someone human, someone discreet. Her mind turned to Alara, a quiet, silver-haired woman who had been her personal attendant since her arrival. Alara had a daughter in the village at the foot of the mountain, a place the vampires rarely visited, deeming it provincial. Alara was human. Alara was loyal to her, not to the crown she wore. That evening, Rose summoned the woman to her private dressing room. Alara entered, her face a mask of quiet concern. She had watched her queen fade for weeks. Your Majesty, she curtsied, her voice soft. You sent for me. Rose's hands were trembling. She clasped them in front of her to still them. Alara, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I need your help. It is a matter of great secrecy. I need you to speak to no one. Alara's gaze was steady. My loyalty is to you, my queen. Always. The simple, heartfelt declaration almost broke her. Rose took a deep, shuddering breath. I need to see a physician, she said, the words tasting like poison. A human one, in the village. Someone who understands women's ailments. Someone who can be trusted to hold their tongue. Understanding dawned in Alara's wise old eyes, followed by a wave of profound sorrow. She did not need to ask the reason. In a court obsessed with lineage, there was only one ailment that would drive a human queen to such secrecy. There is a midwife, Alara said, her voice gentle. Maris. She is old, and her eyes see more than most. She is trusted. She delivered my own granddaughter. Can you arrange it? Rose pressed, a desperate urgency in her tone. In secret, I must not be seen. Alara nodded slowly. It will be difficult, but not impossible. There are servants' passages that lead to the lower gates. We can go at dusk, cloaked as village women returning from the market. The plan was terrifying. A queen, sneaking from her own castle like a thief, but the terror was eclipsed by a sliver of something else, agency. For the first time in weeks, she was not just waiting for her fate to be decided, she was seeking it out. She was taking the smallest measure of control in a life that had spun utterly out of it. Tomorrow, Rose said, her voice firming with a resolve she hadn't felt in an age. We will go tomorrow. The journey was a descent into another world. Dressed in a coarse wool cloak the color of mud, its hood pulled low over her face, Rose followed Alara through a labyrinth of narrow, damp-smelling corridors she never knew existed. These were the arteries of the castle, the hidden passages used by servants to move unseen, keeping the illusion of the palace's effortless grandeur intact. The air was thick with the smell of tallow candles, cooking grease, and mildew. It was the smell of the castle's underbelly, a world away from the perfumed air of the royal apartments. They emerged from a small, unmarked door into a stable yard pungent with the scent of hay and horse. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the sky, and a cold wind swept down from the mountain peaks, carrying the promise of rain. Ilara led her to the lower gates, where the guards, accustomed to the daily traffic of servants and tradespeople, gave their cloaked figures a cursory glance before waving them through. The moment Rose stepped outside the castle walls, the air changed. It was sharper, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. For 2 years, the castle had been her entire world. Now, standing on the cobbled path that wound down to the village, she felt a dizzying sense of both freedom and exile. She was a queen abandoning her post, a wife deceiving her husband. Each step she took away from the castle felt like a betrayal, yet each step was also a reclamation of herself. The village of Silverwood was, nestled in the mountain's shadow, a cluster of timber-framed houses with smoke curling from their stone chimneys. It was a place of simple, mortal life. Children's laughter echoed in the narrow streets, and the aroma of baking bread wafted from an open doorway. It was a world Adrian ruled, but was not a part of. A world that was and was not her own. Maris, the physician, lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, wreathed in ivy and surrounded by a garden of medicinal herbs. Ilara knocked softly on the heavy oak door. It was opened by a woman who looked as ancient and rooted as the mountains themselves. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her eyes the color of faded denim, and they held a startling, clear intelligence. "Ilara," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Her gaze shifted to Rose, who stood half-hidden in the shadows of her hood. Maris's eyes lingered for a moment, and Rose had the unsettling feeling that the old woman saw everything. The fine quality of the wool beneath the drab cloak, the regal bearing she couldn't quite disguise, the raw terror in her eyes. "Bring your friend inside. A storm is coming." The cottage was one room, warm and cluttered. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and shelves were crammed with glass jars of powders and salves. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a place of healing, yet Rose felt a cold dread snake through her. Maris gestured for her to sit on a low stool by the fire. "Take off your cloak, child. Let me see you." Rose's hands fumbled with the clasp. She let the heavy wool fall away, revealing the simple but well-made dress beneath. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Maris looked at her, her expression unreadable. "You have the king's sorrow in your eyes," the old woman said simply. It wasn't a question. Rose's breath hitched. "I need to know," she whispered, her voice trembling. If I am able to bear a child." Maris nodded slowly, a deep understanding in her gaze. She asked no questions about who Rose was, or why she had come in secret. She was a physician, and here was a woman in pain. That was all that mattered. The examination was a quiet, clinical affair, yet it felt like a violation. Maris was gentle, her hands surprisingly steady, but Rose felt herself dissociating, floating somewhere above her own body. She was no longer a queen, no longer a wife, no longer Rose. She was a collection of parts, a biological machine being assessed for its function. She answered the midwife's soft questions about her health, her history. She spoke of the fever she'd had as a girl, the one that had almost taken her. a detail she hadn't thought of in years. Maris listened, her expression unchanging, her hands probing and assessing. When it was over, Rose dressed with numb fingers. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean. "It will take time to be certain," Maris said, washing her hands in a ceramic basin. "I have tests I must conduct, preparations I must read." She was looking at a series of glass vials filled with colored liquids, not at Rose. "I can send word to you through Alara, a sealed scroll. It will take a week, perhaps longer." A week, another week of waiting, of drifting through the castle with this terrible secret lodged in her heart. Rose could only nod, unable to speak. She and Alara left the cottage and stepped back out into the twilight. The wind had picked up, and the first cold drops of rain were beginning to fall. The journey back up the mountain path was harder than the one down. The darkness deepened, and the rain became a steady, miserable drizzle. When the castle loomed into view, its turrets and towers dark silhouettes against the bruised sky, it no longer looked like a home or a sanctuary. It looked like a prison. She had left seeking answers, seeking a sliver of control. But as she slipped back through the lower gates, a ghost returning to her haunting grounds, she felt more trapped than ever. She was no longer just a woman afraid of a pronouncement. She was now a woman waiting for a verdict that had already been written in her own body. The waiting was a unique form of torment, a slow, grinding erosion of her soul. Time became fluid, distorted. A single minute could stretch for an hour as she watched a servant approach down a long hall, her heart seizing with the fear that they carried the scroll. An entire day could vanish in a blur of numb detachment as she sat in the gardens, staring at nothing, the world a muted watercolor painting seen through a film of tears. 7 days, 8, 9. Each morning she awoke with a feeling of dread so profound it was a physical weight on her chest. Each night she lay beside Adrian in their vast bed, feigning sleep, a chasm of silence and secrets separating them. He knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He had stopped asking what it was. Instead, he simply watched her, his silent, sorrowful gaze a constant, unbearable presence. He would reach for her in the night, a gesture of long-held habit, and her body would stiffen, an involuntary rejection that cost them both dearly. He would pull his hand back, and the space between them would grow colder, wider. On the 10th day, she was summoned to a state dinner. It was an unavoidable command performance. She sat at Adrian's right hand on the dais, gowned in sapphire silk, a constellation of diamonds at her throat. She looked the part of the queen, a beautiful, serene doll. Inside, she was screaming. Elder Valerius was seated across from her. Throughout the meal, she could feel his eyes on her. His gaze was not overtly hostile. It was worse. It was analytical. He watched her as a scientist might watch a specimen under glass, assessing its viability. He noted the way she pushed the food around on her golden plate, the faint tremor in her hand as she lifted her wine goblet. He saw the shadows under her eyes that no amount of cosmetic powder could conceal. Every glance felt like a judgment, a confirmation of his own cold pronouncement. She was failing. She was withering. She was proving him right. After the dinner, back in the seeming privacy of their chambers, Adrian finally broke his silence. He waited until her attendants had left, and then he turned to her, his face a mask of controlled anguish. "I cannot do this anymore, Rose," he said, his voice low and strained. "This silence, this distance, it is breaking me." She stood before her vanity, her back to him, staring at her own reflection in the silvered glass. A pale, haunted stranger stared back. "Tell me what I have done," he pleaded, his voice cracking with an emotion he so rarely showed. "Whatever it is, I will fix it. If I have said something, done something, just tell me." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the vanity. The urge to turn, To throw herself into his arms and confess everything was a physical force, a tidal wave of need. She wanted to tell him about the voices, the fear, the secret trip to the village, the verdict that was hanging over her head like a guillotine. She wanted to ask him if it was true. Do you need an heir more than you need me? But the fear of his answer was a gag in her throat. The image of his calm, political face as he said, "I hear your concerns," was branded onto the inside of her eyelids. If he confirmed it, if he admitted that yes, the kingdom's needs superseded their love, she would not survive it. The not knowing was a torment, but the knowing would be an execution. "You have done nothing," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the cavernous room. "I am simply not myself." "Then let me help you find yourself again," he said, taking a step closer. She could see his reflection in the mirror, his face a portrait of desperation. "Talk to me, please. We have never had secrets between us." The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. We have never had secrets. Now a secret was the only thing she had left. It was a poisoned shield, but a shield nonetheless. "I need to be alone," she whispered, turning from the mirror, unable to look at him, unable to look at herself. She walked past him, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor, and retreated to the adjoining sitting room, closing the heavy doors behind her. She heard no sound from the other room. No angry outburst, no sigh of resignation. Just a profound, heavy silence that was filled with all the things they could no longer say to each other. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, and finally, for the first time in 10 agonizing days, she wept. Silent, scalding tears of grief for the love she was convinced she had already lost. The scroll arrived on the 13th day. It was a gray, drizzling afternoon, the kind of day that promised a long and dreary winter. Rose was in her private sitting room, staring into a fire that offered no warmth when Allure entered. The older woman's face was pale, her expression grim. She held a thin, unmarked tube of parchment in her hand. She did not need to say what it was. Rose's heart stopped. For a moment the world went silent and still. The crackling of the fire, the drumming of the rain against the leaded glass, it all faded away. There was only the scroll, a simple object that held the entire weight of her future. Allure approached and held it out. Her hand was trembling slightly. "It came with the baker's delivery," she said, her voice a low murmur. "As instructed." Rose reached out and took it. The parchment felt cold, clinical. She stared at it, at the simple wax seal bearing no crest or mark. This was it, the end of the waiting, the beginning of the end. "Leave me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Allure curtsied and backed out of the room, closing the doors softly behind her, leaving Rose alone with her fate. She walked to her writing desk, the scroll clutched in her hand. She sat down, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were moving through water. For a long moment, she just looked at it, lying on the polished mahogany. It seemed so innocuous. A piece of paper, a few lines of ink. How could something so small destroy a life? With a deep, shuddering breath, she picked it up. Her thumbnail was a white crescent against the dark wax of the seal. She pressed down. The wax cracked with a small, definitive snap. The sound echoed in the silent room like a bone breaking. Her hands shook as she unrolled the parchment. The script was neat, precise, the hand of a woman accustomed to recording facts without emotion. It was a short message. It spoke of uterine scarring, the likely result of a severe childhood fever. It used medical terms she didn't fully understand, words like fibrosis and occlusion. But she didn't need to understand them. Her eyes scanned the dense, spidery text, searching for the one phrase, the one conclusion that mattered. She found it at the bottom, a single, brutal sentence set apart from the rest. "In my considered medical opinion, conception is an impossibility. Barren." The words slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. An impossibility. Not difficult, not unlikely. Impossible. It was a life sentence, a final, irrevocable judgment. She read the sentence again, and again. The ink seemed to writhe on the page, the letters twisting into a mocking smile. A strange, cold calm washed over her, the kind that follows a catastrophic shock. The frantic, terrified hope she had clung to without even realizing it was gone, extinguished in an instant. All that was left was a vast, quiet emptiness. The decision had been made. Not by the elders, not by Adrian, but by her own treacherous body. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hope for. There was only one path left. One final act of love she could perform. She could set him free. She stood up, the scroll still in her hand. This was her resignation. She would not write a tear-stained letter of farewell, full of explanations he already knew. This single piece of parchment said everything that needed to be said. It was the reason. It was the justification. It was the end. She walked from her sitting room into the main bedchamber. The room was empty, quiet. The massive bed with its twilight blue silks looked cold and uninviting. It was a place where an heir should have been conceived. A place that had only magnified her failure. She walked to Adrian's side of the bed. His pillow was cool, immaculate. She smoothed her hand over the fine linen, one last phantom caress. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed the scroll directly in the center of it. It lay there, stark and white against the dark gray linen, an unavoidable truth. A final, silent statement. Her resignation letter. Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind the scroll, the room, the life, the love. Everything. She took nothing with her. Not the jewels that lay like captured starlight in their velvet boxes, not the gowns of silk and brocade that filled her wardrobes, not even the small, simple locket Adrian had given her on their first anniversary. To take anything would be to lay claim to a life that was no longer hers. This was not a departure. It was an erasure. She would leave as she came, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of a love that had nowhere to go. She pulled on the same muddy wool cloak she had worn to the village, its coarse texture a fitting penance. It smelled of rain and earth, the scent of the world outside these suffocatingly beautiful walls. The hood would hide her face, render her anonymous. A queen one moment, a peasant the next. The transition felt strangely, horribly right. She did not seek out Alara to say goodbye. The kind woman had done enough, had risked enough. This last part of the journey had to be undertaken alone. But as she moved through the now unfamiliar corridors of her own home, she said her silent farewells. She paused in the gallery, her gaze falling on a portrait of Adrian, commissioned a year ago. The artist had captured him perfectly. The regal authority, the ancient sadness in his eyes, and the flicker of warmth that was reserved only for her. She reached out and traced the line of his jaw on the cold canvas. "I love you," she whispered to the painted image. "That is why I have to go." She passed the library, the scent of old paper and leather a painful memory of the hours they had spent there, his low voice a soothing murmur as he read to her. She touched the cool marble of a statue they had chosen together for the main hall, her fingers lingering on the stone. Each object was a memory, each memory a fresh cut. This was for him, to free him from her, to allow him to be the king his people needed, to secure the future she could not provide. He would mourn her, perhaps, but he was a king, and he was immortal. He would endure. And in time, he would find a new queen. A vampire, one who could give him the heir the kingdom demanded. The thought was a spike of ice in her heart, but she clung to it. It was necessary. It was right. As she reached the hidden servants' passage, the sound she had been half expecting began. The gentle patter of rain against the high castle windows. It grew steadily, a mournful drumming that matched the rhythm of her own grief. The sky was weeping for her. She slipped through the door and into the narrow, dark corridor, pulling her hood low. The descent was the same as before, but this time it felt final. She was not a queen in disguise. She was a refugee, fleeing the ruins of her life. When she emerged into the stable yard, the drizzle had become a downpour, a cold, relentless autumn rain that sluiced from a leaden sky. It soaked her cloak in seconds, the icy water seeping through to her skin, but she welcomed the chill. It was a distraction from the fire in her chest. The guards at the lower gate were huddled in their sentry box, barely glancing as her solitary, cloaked figure hurried past them and out into the storm. The wind howled, tearing at her hood, trying to expose her. The path down the mountain was already turning to mud, treacherous and slick. She stumbled, her foot sliding, and caught herself on the trunk of a gnarled oak. Her hands were scraped, her dress splattered with mud. She was no longer a queen. She was just a woman, alone in the rain, walking away from the only home, the only love she had ever truly known. She set her face toward the border, a line on a map she had to cross. If she could just make it out of his lands, she could disappear. She could become no one. And Adrian, her love, her king, would be free. Adrian returned to their chambers well after midnight. The council meeting with the elders had been fraught. Valerius and his faction had pushed again, their arguments cloaked in the language of duty and legacy, but their meaning was clear. The human queen was a problem to be solved. Adrian had held them at bay, his authority an iron wall, but it was exhausting. He had spent the entire meeting defending Rose, planning the political maneuvers he would need to silence them for good, all while longing to be with her, to somehow break through the terrible, sad wall she had built around herself. He pushed the doors open, a quiet apology for his lateness already on his lips. Rose? The room was silent and cold. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows on the walls. The bed was empty, the covers turned down but undisturbed. A faint unease, a cold premonition, prickled at the back of his neck. He called her name again, louder this time. Rose? No answer. He strode through the chambers, his unease growing with every silent, empty room. The sitting room, the dressing room, her bathing chamber, all empty. He told himself she was in the library, or perhaps the glass gardens, though she rarely went anywhere at this hour. But the cold feeling in his gut intensified, turning to a knot of pure dread. Something was wrong. He returned to the bedchamber, his eyes scanning the room for any sign, any clue. And then he saw it. On his pillow. A place of rest, of intimacy, of shared dreams. A place that was theirs alone. Lying there, stark and foreign, was a single, sealed scroll. His blood ran cold. He recognized it instantly. Not the scroll itself, but the particular type of unmarked, discreet parchment and the specific, simple wax seal. It was the mark of Maris, the village midwife. A woman whose discretion was sought for the most delicate of human, female afflictions. He moved toward the bed as if in a trance. Every step was heavy, laden with a certainty so terrible he could barely breathe. He knew, even before he touched it, what this was. The past weeks of her sorrow, her flinching from his touch, her haunted eyes, her lies about headaches and fatigue, it all coalesced into a single, devastating point of understanding. He reached out and picked up the scroll. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled. He broke the seal. He unrolled the parchment. His immortal eyes, capable of reading the finest print in the dimmest light, flew across the clinical, spidery script. He saw the words, uterine scarring, fever, fibrosis. And his undead heart, the heart that had not truly beaten in 1,000 years, clenched in a spasm of pure agony. He knew what was coming. He read the final line. Conception is an impossibility. The scroll slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. The world tilted on its axis. He finally understood. He understood everything. He remembered the night of the council meeting, the one she must have overheard. He remembered his own damned, cautious words. I hear your concerns. He had been playing a political game, buying time to protect her, to dismantle the threat the elders posed. But she had not heard a strategy. She had heard a betrayal. She had heard her own death sentence. And for weeks, she had carried this terror alone. She had faced this devastating verdict by herself, believing he was already weighing her worth, preparing to discard her. The thought was a physical blow. He staggered back, his hand flying to his chest, to the place where his heart should be. There was only a cold, aching void. He had failed her. In his arrogance, in his belief that she understood his political machinations, he had utterly, catastrophically failed her. His silence had been a weapon, and it had been aimed directly at the woman he loved more than his own immortal life. A low, guttural sound of pure anguish tore itself from his throat. It was not the sound of a king. It was the sound of a man who had just lost everything. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He acted. He burst from the chambers, his regal composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. He didn't need his guards. He didn't need trackers. This was a hunt of the heart. The scent of her, rose petals and rain, unique, heartbreaking sorrow, was a faint but undeniable trail in the rain-lashed air. It led away from the royal wing, down toward the servants' passages, out into the storm. She was running, and he would tear the world apart to find her. He moved through the storm not as a man, but as a force of nature, a blur of black against the churning gray sky, a shadow given form and desperate purpose. The rain, which fell in blinding, icy sheets, was nothing to him. The wind that howled and tore at the trees was a whisper. The mud that would have mired any mortal man was but a momentary inconvenience. He was an ancient predator, and his prey was the only thing that had ever mattered to him. His mind was a maelstrom of regret and self-loathing. He saw her face, pale and haunted, as she had been for weeks. He saw her flinch from his touch. Each memory was a fresh stab of guilt. How could he have been so blind? He had seen her pain, but he had mistaken it for a passing sadness, a mortal melancholy he could soothe with time and patience. He had never imagined its source was him, that he himself was the author of her agony. The conversation with the elders played over and over in his head, a relentless, torturous refrain. A human queen is a liability. If she is barren, she must be discarded. He had heard their words as a political threat to be managed. She had heard them as the unvarnished truth of her existence. His careful, non-committal response, "I hear your concerns," had been a strategic move in a long and patient war against their antiquated bigotry. He had planned to exile Valerius, to strip Cassian of his titles. He had been preparing the ground to remake his court, to ensure Rose's position as his queen, his equal, was absolute and unassailable for all time. He had wanted to present her with a victory, not burden her with the battle. Stupid. He was a fool, an arrogant, 1,000-year-old fool. He had prized his strategy over her heart. He had protected his crown, but left his queen undefended against the cruelest of blows. He thought of the 2 years they'd had. Before her, his existence had been a long, gray expanse of duty and memory. He had ruled, he had existed, but he had not lived. Then Rose had come into his life, a whirlwind of warmth and laughter and infuriating, wonderful humanity. She had planted flowers in the ancient, barren gardens. She had insisted on lighting fires in the hearths, chasing away the perpetual chill. She had looked at him not as a king or a monster, but as a man. She had seen the loneliness he had hidden for centuries and had, with her simple, courageous love, banished it. She was not a liability. She was the very center of his world. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the cold, detached eternity of his own nature. Without her, the castle was just a pile of stones. Without her, his life was just a stretch of time. Her scent grew stronger, carried on the wind. Rain, sorrow, and a desperate, forward momentum. It led him away from the castle, away from the village, toward the wild, untamed borderlands. He knew where she was going. There was an old marker stone there, a relic from a forgotten kingdom that denoted the edge of his domain. She was trying to leave his protection. She was trying to leave him. The thought spurred him on, his preternatural speed increasing until the forest on either side of the path was nothing but a green and brown smear. He would not let her go. He would not let his own failure be the thing that destroyed them both. He found her there, a small, solitary figure standing in the heart of the raging storm. She was at the very edge of his lands, her hand resting on the moss-covered granite of the ancient border stone. The rain had plastered her dark hair to her scalp and soaked through her simple wool cloak, making her shiver uncontrollably. Mud caked the hem of her dress and clung to her worn boots. She looked small, fragile, and utterly, devastatingly broken. He slowed his approach, forcing the raging storm inside him to quiet. He could not run to her. He could not appear as the monster he felt himself to be. He had to be the man she had once loved. He stepped out from the cover of the trees, the rain running in rivulets down his face, and stood before her. She gasped when she saw him, her whole body jerking in shock. She took a stumbling step back, her hand leaving the stone, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt. "Go back, Adrian," she said, her voice thin and reedy against the howl of the wind. It was a command, but it was threaded with a plea. "Please, just let me go." "I will not," he said, his own voice raw with emotion. He took a slow step toward her, his hands open at his sides to show he meant no harm. "I read the scroll, Rose." A terrible, shuddering sob escaped her. She misunderstood his words as confirmation, as the reason he had come, to finalize her banishment. "Then you know," she wept, the words tumbling out on a wave of despair, the dam of her composure finally breaking. "You know what I am, what I am not. I'm useless, a barren human, a liability, a failure." Each word was a self-inflicted wound, a testament to the pain she had been living with. "I can't give you what you need. I can't give you an heir. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But you're free now. The elders will get what they want." Her words struck him with more force than any physical weapon. Useless. That she could ever think that he had allowed her to believe that, was the greatest single failure of his long existence. The monstrous, blasphemous idea that she, his brilliant, brave, warm-hearted Rose, was nothing more than her ability to bear a child, shattered the last of his control. In a move that defied a millennium of royal bearing and immortal pride, he fell to his knees in the mud and the rain before her. The act was so shocking, so utterly contrary to everything he was, that it silenced her tears. She stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with disbelief. The king of the night, the ancient and powerful ruler of a vast and feared domain, was kneeling at her feet in a storm-drenched wilderness. He looked up at her, his face stripped bare of his crown, his power, his pride. There was only the man, his heart breaking in his eyes for her to see. He reached out and took her icy, trembling hands in his. "I do not need a broodmare," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it shook his entire frame. "I need a queen. My queen." He squeezed her hands, willing his conviction into her. "I chose you, Rose, not your womb, not for an heir, not for an alliance. You." He had to make her understand. He had to undo the damage his silence had wrought. "What you heard in that study, that was not me. That was a king playing a game with fools, a game I should never have played. My first, my only duty was to your heart, and I failed." That silence, Rose, that cowardly political silence, is the greatest regret of my eternal life. I let you believe, even for a second, that their disgusting calculus mattered, that you could ever be discarded. He choked on the word. "You are not a liability. You are my life. These stones," he gestured wildly at the castle, a dark shape in the distance, "are just a pile of rocks without you. My immortality is just a prison sentence. You brought light into 1,000 years of darkness. You are my home." She was staring at him, her breath catching in her throat, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She was starting to hear him, truly hear him. He looked directly into her eyes, pouring every ounce of his love, his regret, his absolute devotion into his final words. "There is no heir, no kingdom, no power on this earth that I would choose over you. You are enough. Rose, you have always been enough." The truth of it, the raw, undeniable sincerity in his voice, in his posture, in his eyes, finally broke through the wall of her pain and fear. The belief that she was worthless, a belief that had taken root and grown into a suffocating monster, finally withered and died in the face of his absolute, unconditional love. A fresh wave of tears came, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of catharsis, of a love she thought she had lost returning to her with a force that was overwhelming. Her knees gave out, and she sank into the mud with him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, sheltering her from the storm as best he could. He buried his face in her wet hair, whispering her name over and over again like a prayer. She clung to him, her hands fisted in his shirt, her tears soaking into the fine fabric. They were just two people, a king and a queen, kneeling in the mud, stripped of everything but their love for one another. The political problem of the elders still existed. The biological fact of her body had not changed. But none of it mattered. They would face it all, together. The rain continued to pour down, washing away the mud, the tears, and the pain of the last few weeks, leaving only the clean, unshakable truth of their connection. This was not an ending. This was a new beginning, forged in a storm and sealed in the mud, a promise that they were, and always would be, enough.